Hello, BookTube. As some of you may know, in celebration of BookTube's massive event, Victober, where we celebrate all things Victorian, all things Victorian books, literature, nonfiction, plays, poetry, uh, Jordan Parsons and I are doing a read-along of Anthony Trollope's novel, The Way We Live Now. And we were planning, we are going to do this in 4 parts in the month of October. I think the 1st of October snuck up on both of us. And maybe Jordan doesn't have a whole lot of experience doing read-alongs because he started reading the book on the 1st, aiming, obviously, for the 2nd weekend in October. And I intend to abide by that. I don't want our read-along. We're doing this 25 chapters at a time, and I don't want our discussion videos of that first 25 chapters to be a week apart from each other. So I will wait and discuss that then. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this novel now. It doesn't have to be a long video. But those of you who are joining along on this read-along, this is Trollope's longest novel. It came out in book form in 1875. But the occasion for the book was a trip that Trollope took to Australia and New Zealand. He took that trip and he wrote the whole time, and he had a fun time in the grindy way that he can. But there's a thing that happens when you leave your beloved homeland for the first time. Or not for the first time, but when you leave your beloved homeland for a long time, not only does absence make the heart grow fonder, so that you are eager to get back. You miss the familiar confines of your own place, but you see it sharper too. When you get back, you suddenly see it sharper. And the England that Trollope saw when he returned to it horrified him. It suddenly seemed an incredibly tawdry and degraded place that was racked by one massive financial scandal after another, one big bloated swindler after another, taking thousands of people for their hard-earned all, or being the talk of London before they were driven out of London or whatnot. And that had happened for the last 1,000 years, but Trollope, fresh returned from the provinces, was horrified by it, and did what he always did whenever he experienced strong emotion of any kind. He went right to his writing desk. But he started to write. He started to write a book about the iniquities of that world. That originally was going to be a very literary book. It was going to be mainly about the iniquities of the literary world that he knew so well, and that I really wish that he had written that book. But I wouldn't trade this book for all the tea in China, because he went to it with fire in his veins, which wasn't always true when Trollope was blocking out and then composing a book, making notes for it. A lot of times he did it with a great deal of complacency. In fact, it's that tone of complacency that comes out most strongly in his autobiography, that did more than pretty much anything to sink his posthumous literary reputation as a hack and a meter man, because of the way that he talks about writing in that book. There's no mention of a muse anywhere in it. It never comes anywhere near the flanks of Mount Helicon. Instead, it's the working autobiography of a working author. But it was the work itself that impeded and changed this book, because Trollope had already promised another book. He'd already promised another publisher a different book. So he dashed off a separate novel. He put The Way We Live Now aside for a bit and dashed off a novel named Harry Heathcote that is not good. You can tell that it's dashed off. The only reason that I would argue it's 2 or 3 times better than the average Victorian novel is because Trollope was just that good. But his heart's not in it. There's no fire in Harry Heathcote at all. It's a very enjoyable book. Don't get me wrong. It's a tiny little thing. It's nowhere near the size of this, but it doesn't have any of the bite or the fervor of this book. And then when he was done with that, when he dashed off his novel to fulfill the money that he'd already collected, he went back to write this book and just kept writing. Wrote an enormous book, teeming with characters, teeming with subplots, in which the plot about the tawdry manipulativeness of the literary world takes a back seat to those financial swindlers that so outraged him when he was reading about them in the news when he came back from Australia and New Zealand. Specifically one. He takes all of those financial swindlers and bundles them together into one utterly memorable character, Mr. Melmot, who is the main character in this book, no matter what you want to say about the two young lovers or the struggling Lady Carberry or anything like that. We'll get to all those characters next week. But I mentioned that it was rare for Trollope to come to a book with fire in his eyes. That he almost never did that. There were plenty of novelists and nonfiction writers in his rough time period that couldn't write any other way than that. But for Trollope, it was a machinery. It was a machine product. It was a conveyor belt. He knew he wanted to get so many words written per day, and he did, no matter what. No matter what. On the crossing over to Australia, there were 2 different times where his cabin was pitching 10 feet left and 10 feet right during the period he'd set aside for writing. He still wrote. Keep in mind, I'm talking about a bottle of ink here. And there was a time coming back from Australia, the same thing. He still did it. He forswore that habit almost never. So it was kind of rare. I mean, he still kept his writing habits, which you should all have in preparation for NaNoWriMo. You should all establish ironclad habits like that. But he kept those habits while he was writing this book, but it was written with a particular kind of anger that doesn't animate most of his books. And boy, can you tell. Reading this thing, you can definitely tell. There is a pair of innocent, sort of nitwitty lovers, young lovers. Trollope hardly ever wrote a major work without that. He liked to write love stories. It's kind of charming about him. He liked to write love stories, and I think was really good at it. They are in here, but oh my, they are a minor note. The major notes in here are all of the characters, major and minor, who are only engaged in cheating each other, lying to each other, manipulating each other, and not for any good ends either. None of them are any good. None of them are worthwhile at all. We get a character acting like an absolute cad or a hypocrite or a two-face in one chapter, and in a normal Trollope novel, that would be followed up by a more intimate chapter in which we learn a little bit more about them so that we feel a little sympathy for them. So we sort of understand the motives that made them act so horribly in the previous chapter. In this book, they act just as horribly, and we get that follow-up chapter, but it just makes things worse. It doesn't make them any more likable. It makes them less likable. That is true for almost every character in this book. Even the positive characters, there are a tiny handful of characters who have not anything really wrong with them. Even they have flaws falling off them. It's not normal. It doesn't read like a normal Trollope novel, and mainly because that moral barometer is badly broken. In fact, it's the moral barometer that usually guides a Trollope novel not only is broken, but it's almost like the weatherkeeper, the guy who taps that barometer, usually Trollope's narrator, who's never named and is not always Trollope, but is always present. A lot of you in our Trollope read-alongs have pointed out that you really feel like someone is telling you this story. They know everything, but they are still a person. In this book, it feels like that narrator is not only not checking that barometer, but that he's sitting there laughing at it, that he's sneering at the very idea of it. And it showed in the final book. It showed in the public reception of the final book. Critics had no idea what to make of this book, and the public didn't like it. It was originally serialized, and the serialization just wasn't selling. And the whole process of serializing a novel and then bringing it out in 3 triple-decker big volumes was starting to change right around the time when this novel was coming to press. But even so, I think it still would have met with a very lukewarm reception. Not selling was the ultimate rejection for Trollope. Because what did the reading public have here? Now we can look back on it having seen a century of worse, and also respecting Trollope as an artist. But the reading public was mostly going to him for what happens next and who can I root for. And you didn't have to get this in many serials. You didn't have to be buying this in magazine form very long before you realized there isn't anybody here that I can root for. There are a couple of nitwits, but there's nobody grand who's any good. And there's nobody good who's in any way grand. And that is not a combination that had never happened before for Trollope. His gigantic, loyal body of readers have never encountered anything this dyspeptic, this cynical and bitter, where everyone is hollow right down to the bottom, where nothing is real. It's all swindle and fake. So little wonder that the sales dropped off. The publisher had to work a little publishing magic with the book printing. And it signaled, I think, a sea change for Trollope. In his autobiography, he looked back on this book dispassionately, thought it wasn't the worst thing that he'd ever written, but he perfectly acknowledged that the love story is a little weak. Maybe some of the other characters in the book are a little weak. I think he was being way too harsh on himself. I think he was mainly informed by those retroactive verdicts on his book by the fact that he never missed a review of his own work. He was very conscious of how it was being received and how it was selling, how it was doing in lending libraries and whatnot. In this case, as in so many cases like that, the author is simply wrong. Posterity has more and more inclined to the view that this is Trollope's best book. Now, I don't know if that's a sign of the times. It could be. We live in a very, very cynical age, and the late 20th century is when that started, and that's also when the estimate of this book started going up. So it could be just that a very cynical age was seeing in this thing something that it liked, whether or not it was any good. But I'm not much a product of that century, and I would almost agree. It's not my favorite Trollope novel, but I love it. Dearly, dearly love it. Despite the fact that it's so angry and so misanthropic. And I wonder if you're coming into this for our read-along next weekend, if you're coming into this for our read-along and you've never read Trollope before, or maybe you have, maybe you've read, for instance, Barchester Towers, his most famous book, bears almost no relation to this thing in terms of the storytelling or the archetypes that are in it. You're going to be groping around for those Trollope easy chairs, and you're not going to find them. There aren't any. I wonder what you'll make of it. We're reading the first 25 chapters for next week, and I'm wondering what you'll make of those 25 chapters. We're going to do 25 chapters for next week, and then 25 chapters every week after that until we finish. It's a neat 4 blocks of 25 chapters. So I just wanted to talk a little about the way we live now, and we'll come back to it next week when we talk about chapters 1 through 25 in detail. So I will leave a link to Jordan's channel down below, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.